welcome to episode 333 of Stand Up Pete Dominic Daily, where every weekday you get a great big helping, a big recap and rundown of the last 24 hours of news in about 20 to 30 minutes, unless you listen at speed and a half, or if you're an absolute psycho, double speed, which makes it 10 to 15 minutes of news. Anyway, most episodes also welcome two expert guests who I conduct a well-prepared expert interview with from my solar-powered converted garden shed where I always sit and often stand to reach my standing goal. How is that even an exercise goal? Standing. I nail it every day just to be able to live up to the name of the show. Stand up also means to stand up and care about issues and people and fight apathy, which is what I'm going for every day. Joining me today is Frontline and ProPublica correspondent A.C. Thompson, who is an award-winning journalist and really cool guy who I was psyched to get the opportunity to sit down and chat with. I think I was standing up a lot, too. Anyway, we talked about the new Frontline special on PBS that premiered last week called American Insurrection. You must watch this. Links to it in today's show notes. I want to say a special hello and thank you to everyone who supports independent media, specifically this daily podcast with a paid subscription. We have about 830 subscribers in the Stand Up with Pete Dominic community, and you are what powers this daily show, and you are who I am accountable to. So pop me an email, standupwithpete@gmail.com, about anything. Send your nature photos, your hashtag vitamin N, and I will include them in every day's email for subscribers. If you listen to the show a lot or even a little, please help keep it going every day by signing up for a paid subscription. Patreon.com/Pete Dominic, or click on the paid subscription link in the show notes. I'm not a genius at marketing. It's not my favorite thing to do. I like to do the actual show, the work, not always promote it. And eventually I'll get someone on board to help me do that, but we got to get to at least 3,000 subscribers before I do that. Although, maybe I could pay someone part-time. It's hard to organize. Anyway, if you have ideas as to how to promote the show, please email standupwithpete@gmail.com. I'm told that post and review and rating on Apple Podcasts, of course, that is one of the best things you can do to promote this insightful and entertaining daily classroom. And thank you to Bumble90, who left the latest review, who wrote, "It's a daily treat, Pete, that is, who has the best guests and most informative conversations. Show is insightful, hilarious, genuine, and consistently terrific. If you want to hear smart people talking about important stuff in a humble and informal way, this is the show for you. Keep it up, Pete." Whoever you are, Bumble90, thank you. Thank you. That is a great review. I love the way you captured what I'm doing every day, and I can't do it without you. So thank you for joining me. It is the last 10 days, the last third of April, and then comes May, and with it, flowers, unless you're out in the West where apparently you're having a drought. But plenty of rain here in the Northeast, and I spent the weekend in the garden, in the greenhouse, and getting the plants ready. Spent Sunday morning with my buddy's daughter, Lily. Shout out to you, Lily, for helping me get these plants, and she put some seeds in, had some great times this weekend with the family as well. Hope you did, and now it's time to get to everything going on in the world and in America with what I call the last 24. All right, let's take a look at what was in the news media zeitgeist according to my very comprehensive scanning in all ways on social media, on the big news websites, and all of the cable news and everything else. And, of course, it is Monday, so you got the Sunday shows, and it seems like the main topics of conversation were, of course, police violence against the black community across this country, more gun violence in general. You heard, of course, I'm sure, about the shooting that killed 8 at the Indianapolis FedEx plant. There were also mass shootings in Austin, Texas, and Ohio. So there's lots of conversation, of course, about that. And believe it or not, we are still in a pandemic with spikes all over the globe. So I will do my best to try to recap a little bit about all of that and maybe some things I didn't just mention. But let's start with the best of the Sunday shows, and that is Velshi on MSNBC. In terms of the mainstream corporate media shows, nobody does it better than, I think, Ali Velshi, who Saturdays and Sundays broadcasts 8 to 10 a.m. East. You should tape that show. You should watch that show. He gets great experts on, just as he did this weekend, where he spoke with civil rights attorney and former head of the Minneapolis NAACP, Nikema Levy Armstrong. He mentioned the arrest of the Army lieutenant from a couple of weeks ago. Well, the video of which surfaced from a couple of weeks ago in Virginia. And this is what she had to say.
They always put these issues on the people who are just minding their own business and get pulled over. There's such a heavy focus on compliance within law enforcement that if you do not do exactly what the police tell you to do, they think that it's a license to beat you and to kill you. And we have seen time and time again, like in the case of Philando Castile, as a recent example, even when you do exactly what the officers tell you to do, they still use it as a justification to use deadly force. And then when those circumstances happen, we have the majority population, we have white people saying that, oh, they deserved it. If only they had done this, if their parents had raised them right, if they didn't live in X kind of community, this wouldn't have happened. And that to me is an abomination. I can only imagine the excuses that were made when fugitive slaves were beaten, when people were lynched in this country. And we have a similar dynamics happening today. It's unconscionable and it is completely unacceptable. That lieutenant probably saved his own life by moving into a well-lit area and reaching his hands out of the window. But it shouldn't take all of that. People like Kyle Rittenhouse, a 17-year-old, could shoot up a protest and literally kill people and walk away, as the chief said, and go back home like nothing ever happened. So we live in a country that has two different systems of justice, one for white people and one for everyone else. It's really unconscionable, and it is beyond time for change.
That's Nikema Levy Armstrong on Velshi on MSNBC. On Real Time Friday night, Bill Maher welcomed a woman named Rosa Brooks, who I thought was very interesting. She's a law professor, a journalist, author, foreign policy commentator. She also became a police officer when she was like 40. And so a real unique, interesting, smart expert.
Became a cop.
I did.
And what did you learn from that experience that would help us get through this difficult moment in American history?
So I learned, here's a dirty little secret about cops, that they don't really get much training in how to use their weapons. When I went through the police academy, we had 2 weeks of firearms training. First week was just in the classroom. Second week, about 3 hours a day on the range. And then you qualify, you're done. Twice a year, you requalify. You watch a few PowerPoint slides as a refresher, and you're done. So
this is about the amount of what I put into it.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of people walking around with lethal weapons who don't really know what they're doing.
Interesting. And it seemed to me the theme, a lot of it was that cynicism is really the overarching problem. Mm-hmm. I mean, racism is part of it. A lot of things are part of it, but they're just beaten down.
We ask cops to be social workers and medics and warriors and mediators, and any one of those jobs is really hard, and most people can't do any one of those jobs really well. If you ask some 25-year-old to do all of them in the same 10-hour shift, they're going to do them really badly.
Yeah.
And you know, suicide kills more cops every single year than every other cause combined.
Did you see Pat Robertson is speaking out against the cops?
I mean, he came across as woke in that interview. That's the only time I would ever use that word to describe Pat Robertson.
I don't know if he's literally woke.
That's foreign policy expert Ian Bremmer and Real Time with Bill Maher on HBO. Also heard on this issue from civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump on This Week on ABC. Thought this was pretty interesting, and I wanted to add it to the mix here on this issue. Anchor Martha Raddatz asked Benjamin Crump what would be the consequences if Derek Chauvin, who is on trial for the murder of George Floyd, is found not guilty in the final phase, maybe I guess the final week of the case.
if he is found not guilty, as the nation braces for that verdict, what would you say to the people of Minneapolis?
I would say, once again, the American legal system has broken our heart, and that we cannot condone this excessive use of force, America. We cannot condone this inhumanity, America. We cannot condone this evil that we saw on that video where Derek Chauvin kept his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And we have to finally have this racial reckoning, America, because if we don't, then people are going to continue to have these emotional protests. And I am tired, as many black people are tired of hearing when they kill unarmed black people. I mean, from the local level all the way to the President of the United States, they say it is tragic that Daunte Wright was killed, but looting is unacceptable. Well, what I want the President and everybody to add to that line, Martha, is killing unarmed black people is unacceptable. We have to send that message to the police, because the crux of the matter is this. I was born black and I'm a die black, but police do not kill me because I am black.
Ooh, powerful stuff from Benjamin Crump. Martha Raddatz also asked him about the case right there on the outskirts of Minneapolis. The killing of Daunte Wright, who the police officer now has been arrested for. You know, that's the taser or the gun, pulled over the kid. Anyway, here that question is. I thought this was interesting, too.
In the case of Daunte Wright in Brooklyn Center, the officer there has been charged with second-degree manslaughter after claiming it was an accident and she thought it was a taser she was using. You said the officer simply saw Wright as expendable. You also said that you will not stop until there's meaningful policing, justice reform, until we reach the goal of true equality. What does that look like to you?
Well, it means that we hold police officers accountable and we change the laws in America where you have the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed to change the culture and the behavior of policing in America, especially as it relates to marginalized minorities.
All right, somehow that clip got cut off, but that is Benjamin Crump on ABC's This Week with Martha Raddatz. And before I get to the other shootings and violence and interviews that I wanted to share about that, I want to play for you a couple clips on the Anglo-Saxon caucus. You hear about this news? Any Anglo-Saxons listening? I'm still not quite sure what it means to be Anglo-Saxon. I asked if I'm Anglo-Saxon the other night on Twitter. I mean, I'm Lebanese, Italian, Irish. What does that make me? Anyway, over the weekend, there was reporting that Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene would be launching something called the America First Caucus, bringing together a group of far-right lawmakers known for their very controversial, what can only be described as white nationalist, white supremacist rhetoric. And the news outlet Punchbowl News obtained a flyer promoting the new caucus, which called for, quote, common respect for uniquely Anglo-Saxon political traditions, pushed series of conspiracy theories about election integrity. The flyer also outlined a nativist argument warning that mass immigration poses a threat to the long-term existential future of America as a unique country with a unique culture and unique identity. Here is Punchbowl News' Anna Palmer describing this scoop on Meet the Press yesterday, with the consistently terrible Chuck Todd going into a little further detail.
Infrastructure that befits the progeny of European architecture, and post-1965 immigrants decrease the capital to labor ratio, and as I was pointing out, a profound effect that would have on Asian Americans here. Anna Palmer, you put this out, and boy, all of a sudden, sunshine does seem to bring out at least some response to this. How are Republicans handling this idea?
Well, a couple of ways. I think you've seen a lot of the members who were potentially going to join it distance themselves from it. You've certainly seen members like Senate Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy not name this group in particular, but put out tweets trying to say that this is not a representative of the Republican Party. But to me, what is important here and stunning is the fact that this used to be just a few outliers in the Republican Party, but now the fact that they were trying to form a caucus and trying to form a group of members that were going to back this, some even Matt Gaetz, after it became public, said, yes, I'm going to join it, that is becoming more of the mainstream of where the Republican Party is. And it's not where John Boehner, who you just spoke to, is anymore. And that's going to be something they're going to have to deal with going forward.
And now, much more interestingly, here is the New Yorker's Jelani Cobb, who's excellent, on Velshi, describing a little bit the history of Anglo-Saxonism in America. This is great and super important.
I mean, specifically that language of Anglo-Saxonism, which I think is very important because, for us looking at this, certainly people who are cognizant of the history of race in this country, you understand, and especially for what we see in Tucker Carlson and kind of racial replacement paranoia and these ideas, a real return to like the classic 19th century incarnations of racism, where they believed that only specific people were capable of democracy. That's what Anglo-Saxonism was. It said that unless you were descended from that specific strand of European ancestry, or the German, the Teutonic, that you really weren't capable of participating in a democratic society. And then in 1955, when Emmett Till was killed, and his killers were set free, the defense attorneys said, before the jury went to deliberation, I'm sure that each Anglo-Saxon one of you has the courage to acquit these men. And so using that language harkens to the worst, most undiluted strains of American racism. And that's exactly what they were trying to reincarnate there.
Oh, that was a great soundbite. A lot of history packed into that from Jelani Cobb. Again, back on MSNBC's Velshi. Tape it. Tell Ali Velshi I sent you. Okay, now let's get to some of the horrible gun violence from over the weekend. You had CNN's Pamela Brown interviewing a Kentucky lawmaker named James Comer. This is on Saturday, and everybody's heard this argument before, but you haven't quite heard the pushback made so perfectly and succinctly, and then, of course, the guy arguing, the Republican congressman arguing about gun violence regulations, having no idea how to respond. Listen to this. It's good.
And if you look at the states that have banned guns and the cities that have banned guns, Chicago, Washington, D.C., they have some of the highest rates of gun violence. So just passing laws banning guns doesn't solve the problem. But we have a problem in America. And I think Republicans realize that, and we want to address the issue.
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but it's sometimes different points are made, and I just want to make sure that we look at the numbers and facts when you say something. But I did look at the numbers for crimes in cities and states with strict gun laws, and I saw what you had said repeatedly, but nearly 2/3 of crime guns recovered in states with strong gun laws were originally sold in states with weak gun laws. So if gun laws don't matter, why are criminals going to states with weaker gun laws, bringing that gun back to a state with a stronger gun laws and committing crimes?
Well, I can't answer that.
Of course you can't, because there is no answer. There is no argument, because these regulations do work. Not all of the time, but lots of the time. Some of the time, it matters. I make this argument, and many have made this argument. I made it on the Joe Rogan show a couple of years ago, or over a year and a half ago now, I suppose it was. And I'm still getting his crazy gun-loving listener fans attacking me on Twitter for making that same argument. State and local municipalities have made all kinds of laws regulating guns, who can own them, what kind of ammo, where they can bring them, and it works. It matters. Not all the time, but it does work a lot. But we need a federal plan, a national plan, because as long as you can just hop right over to Indiana, get a gun, and use it in Chicago, that's not going to work. All right, let me change gears, just give you one clip on foreign policy. Super significant announcement from the President of the United States, Joe Biden, which, by the way, why does the president get to decide when we are going to withdraw troops? There is way too much power and responsibility for the executive branch to make such decisions. I don't know how that doesn't go through Congress. I got to talk to some experts about that. But anyway, Joe Biden did announce that we're going to be pulling out by September 11th of this year after 20 years. A lot of controversy from the military types. I do want to say that everybody knows about the military-industrial complex, that famous quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower about that. Do I say just Dwight D. Eisenhower? Why did I just put his initial? Is that even his middle initial? Anyway, talks about the military-industrial complex, where he said we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. That sounds shadowy and that sounds conspiratorial. The bottom line is there are hundreds and thousands of jobs in these defense contracting companies, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and so on and so forth, the security companies, all of it, the weapons makers, manufacturers, there's so much money. That's why the budget for the Pentagon, one of the reasons is that it's almost $800 billion. And one of the reasons why it's so hard to turn it around, because those are real people, real Americans working in those companies. If you have an answer as to how to handle that politically or in any way, then let me know. But here is Anthony Blinken. He is our Secretary of State, talking about this issue with Martha Raddatz again on ABC's This Week.
Mr. Secretary, you've heard the reaction from the generals who commanded troops in Afghanistan, including the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs and David Petraeus, who went on to become CIA director, who say this will leave America more vulnerable to terrorist threats, with Joe Dunford saying it would also have a catastrophic effect in Afghanistan itself. Your reaction?
Look, Martha, I just got back from Kabul. I met with President Ghani, met with other leaders there. That was just after coming from NATO, meeting with all of our allies. And across the board, I heard support for the president's decision and the path ahead. Here's the reality. And by the way, I have great respect for General Petraeus, General Dunford, and others. But we had a very deliberate and fully informed process leading up to the decision by the president. And the fact is this. We went to Afghanistan 20 years ago. And we went because we were attacked on 9/11. And we went to take on those who had attacked us on 9/11 and to make sure that Afghanistan would not again become a haven for terrorism directed at the United States or any of our allies and partners. And we achieved the objectives that we set out to achieve. Al-Qaeda has been significantly degraded. Its capacity to conduct an attack against the United States now from Afghanistan is not there. And of course, Osama bin Laden was brought to justice 10 years ago. So the president felt that as we're looking at the world now, we have to look at it through the prism of 2021, not 2001. The terrorism threat has moved to other places, and we have other very important items on our agenda, including the relationship with China, including dealing with everything from climate change to COVID. And that's where we have to focus our energy and resources.
All right, finally, I want to get to, well, not finally, I want to get to climate change as well as COVID right now. Worldwide COVID-19 death toll tops a staggering 3 million. The global death toll from the coronavirus topped a staggering 3 million people Saturday amid repeated setbacks in the worldwide vaccination campaign and a deepening crisis in places such as Brazil, India, and France. That is the Associated Press. Here is Anthony Fauci answering a question about why people who have been vaccinated need to continue wearing masks from a man whose name trends every Sunday for being so bad at his job, Chuck Todd on Meet the Press.
Why does a vaccinated person have to wear a mask?
Okay, this is something that as we get more information, it's going to be pulling back that you won't have to. But currently the reason is that when you get vaccinated, you are clearly diminishing dramatically your risk of getting infected. That's one of the things we've got to make sure everybody understands. You dramatically diminish it. However, what happens is that you might get infected and get absolutely no symptoms, not know you're infected, and then inadvertently go into a situation with vulnerable people. And if you don't have a mask, you might inadvertently infect them. Now, there's a small risk of that, but it's there. The other thing is that there may be variants that are circulating. We know New York area has their own variant, a 526. There's a South African variant. Fortunately for us, Chuck, the 117 variant that is dominant in Europe and in UK is also now dominant in the United States. Thank goodness the vaccine works very well against that variant.
And then Dr. Anthony Fauci moved over to CBS with Margaret Brennan, who asked him I thought a very interesting and important question. Here's that.
The point of variants, right? One of the concerns is the virus swirling outside U.S. borders. According to the World Health Organization, we are approaching the highest rate of infection that we have seen so far during this pandemic. So even with these good headlines in America, the rest of the world is still really struggling. What's the bottom line from that? Does this mean Americans just shouldn't go abroad?
No. It means that when you have a global pandemic, Margaret, you have to have a global response. And that's the reason why we've got to make sure that we participate, which we are doing, in COVAX, which is the organization that is of states, of organizations, to try and make sure that we get vaccines to those countries, mostly low and middle income countries, that don't have the opportunity or the resources to get it. We've got to respond globally. We've got to be part of the global response. Otherwise, even when we have a pretty good control of things and we're doing good right here, what's going to happen is that there's always the threat that one of those variants that almost certainly will evolve if you have a lot of viral dynamics elsewhere, that sooner or later it will get to this country. So we've got to look at this both domestically and globally.
And let's head back one last time to MSNBC, where Ali Velshi had my friend Peter Hotez on to talk about the controversy over the pause in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Of the roughly 7 million people who have been vaccinated with Johnson & Johnson, there have been 6 confirmed cases of developing a rare but severe blood clot. All of the known cases so far were in 33-year-old white women, 6 white women, 6 to 13 days after the vaccine. 1 was taking birth control. There were pre-existing conditions. 3 had obesity, 1 with high blood pressure, 1 with asthma. None had known disorders with blood before then. The most prevalent symptom reported had been headaches, both in initial and later worsening conditions. 3 of the women remain hospitalized. 2 are in intensive care. 1 has been discharged. And of course, there was the 1 death that was reported. But Peter Hotez was on MSNBC, and Ali Velshi asked him about the tough decision that had to be made to, or that was made to, pause the giving the Johnson & Johnson vaccine.
Blood clotting is higher from COVID-19 than from the vaccine, which may be statistically true, but that's really not sort of necessarily how we think about vaccines, right? And it does, there's this underlying vaccine hesitancy that we're trying to overcome. How should you think about that? That it's better to not get coronavirus, but I don't actually want to deliberately take an injection that may have some, provide me with some increased risk of getting a clot.
Yeah, if you could identify a specific group that's at higher risk of getting cerebral thrombosis after the vaccine, I think that would be the best outcome. You know, when I first heard of this, Ali, my original thought was, well, maybe these are individuals who just got a single dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine and were unfortunate enough to get COVID-19 right after that, and then had the cerebral thrombosis on that basis. But there does seem to be some link, and that's going to be really important. And even though the U.S. has other options, many countries don't. For many countries, all they have are the J&J AstraZeneca vaccine and the Russian Sputnik V vaccine, which is also an adenovirus vaccine and may be doing the same thing. So it's really critical that we sort this out, not only to protect American citizens, but to protect the world.
Okay, and demand for the vaccine is slowing in some areas. It's obviously still up in a lot of areas, and everybody now over 18 in the whole country is apparently allowed to at least get the vaccine. But the fact that demand is slowing in some parts of the U.S., usually with conservative men especially, you've heard about the statistics. Well, I thought this was interesting, so I wanted to share it with you because Frank Luntz is he's a prick. I don't like him at all, but he is a linguist and a polling expert. He's a pollster. He was on Fox News on Sunday, and he said that new polling shows that people are now more confident in the vaccine after the Johnson & Johnson pause, which is what they hoped the outcome would be. Hopefully that's right. Here's that.
How do you convince people to get vaccinated when they think it's related to mail ballots or Bill Gates trying to kill them?
The De Beaumont Foundation research found it clear. Number one, you start with your doctor. And that's why next week I'm going to try to work with a group of people to get doctors themselves to send out videos, 90 seconds, saying they got vaccinated and they want their patients to get vaccinated. Number two, and it's over 90% of doctors that have been vaccinated. Number two, you have to take the politics out of it, which means Trump needs to compliment Joe Biden for getting the vaccine out as quickly as Biden's administration did. And the Biden administration needs to compliment the Trump administration for getting the vaccine developed as quickly as you did. Number three, you talk about cutting bureaucracy and red tape, not cutting corners. Number four, you communicate that the vaccine is just like a seatbelt, that you don't use it, that you should not need to use it, but you want to make sure that you've done it to be prepared.
Let me jump in. Let me jump because we've got half a minute. Actually, Donald Trump issued a statement criticizing the Biden administration over the pausing of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. How much is that pause and the coverage a potential setback for your efforts?
So let's break some news right now. We're going to produce a poll tomorrow night. I've seen the data. We're going to release it. That's going to show that the American people are more likely to trust the vaccine because the FDA and the CDC are willing to step in and say, wait a minute, we're not convinced of this, so we want to take a look. People are more confident in the vaccine, not less confident, because they know that there are people watching out for them, even if it's only 6 people out of 6.8 million vaccines.
Well, I hope you're right on that, because obviously the other reaction is, see, I told you it was right to be worried about the vaccine. But Frank Luntz, appreciate you being here. Thanks.
All right, so hopefully Frank Luntz's polling is right about that, and these folks get the vaccine, because you're not gonna have Trump doing what he suggested, clearly. All right, the end of this week, and the final thing I want to talk about and play for you, the end of this week is going to be the White House Climate Summit. John Kerry is on his way to China. Or is in China, and he is the special envoy on climate change. Senate Democrats last week introduced new legislation to help fight climate, and I want to play just a couple of clips of that. First of all, here's Senator Bernie Sanders saying the debate is over. It's over.
In my view, we are living through a pivotal moment, not only in the history of our country, not only in the history of the global community, but in the history of humanity. When we talk about our responsibilities as human beings, as parents and as grandparents, there is nothing more important than leaving this country and the entire planet healthy and habitable for our kids, grandkids, and future generations. This is a moral responsibility that we cannot shirk. So today, let us be clear. The debate is over. The scientific community has spoken in a virtually unanimous voice. Climate change is real. It is caused by human activity and is already causing devastating damage to our country and throughout the world. The scientists have told us that we as a global community have less than a decade, fewer than 10 years, to act boldly to transform our energy system away from fossil fuels and into energy efficiency and sustainable energies, or our entire planet will face irreparable harm. If we do not get our act together, we will see more devastating and extreme heat. We will see more floods, more rising sea levels, more extreme weather disturbances, more ocean acidification, more drought, more famine, more disease, and more human
suffering. I don't know how to cut it off. But Bernie Sanders saying the planet is going to burn, baby, burn, and we got to do something about it. Another great senator on this is Sheldon Whitehouse. And he talked about the discrepancy between what corporate America is telling the public about its attitude on climate change and what it tells Congress about its attitude on climate change. And that discrepancy, not good. Here is Sheldon Whitehouse.
Corporate presence on this issue is still net negative. Even if you take out the fossil fuel industry's continued efforts from behind front groups and with dark money to stop progress, even if you remove all of them, the remaining sectors of corporate America are still net negative. It is telling that neither Ranking Member Lindsey Graham, nor Mr. Oliver know what the position of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is on a price on carbon. It shows that their statements that they nominally support one are sure nominal. And I can tell anybody who's listening that my colleagues on the Republican side, which is where the pressure has been focused, don't see any countervailing pressure to worry about from anywhere in corporate America. Not from Wall Street. They've got a big lobbying apparatus. It's not deployed on this. Not from Silicon Valley. TechNet's performance on climate politically has been a disgrace. Not from the agricultural sector, not from big ag, not from the consumer products lobbies. Nobody from corporate America who touches Congress directly is expressing any interest in getting anything done on climate. And I will tell you that when the BRT has a meeting or the CLC has a meeting and they make a statement or an announcement or they send a letter to President Biden, all that is good. But if it isn't touching Congress, it doesn't have effect in Congress. And time is running out for corporate America, if it really cares about this issue, to tell its damn lobbyists and trade associations to take it seriously. The discrepancy between what corporate America tells the public about its attitude on climate change and what it tells Congress about its attitude on climate change is a disgraceful discrepancy. Every major American corporation ought to do an independent audit of its own lobbying and electioneering and political influence efforts in the last decade. And I think CEOs would be very surprised to find where their company's footprint is on climate change, because I will suspect that it will very often be exactly adverse to their stated public position. Talk about sustainability. That's not sustainable. So that's the point I wanted to make. If that changes, a lot of gateways open. And the measure of when that has changed is when a Republican senator or member of Congress will stand up and say, I'm behind this bill. Here's something I will stake my flag on. I'm behind this bill that's an economy-wide carbon measure.
Excellent analysis from Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island. And he wrote a great book, by the way, that I highly recommend. And I reached out to his people. I should reach out again to try to get him on to discuss that issue. That book is called Capture: The Corporate Infiltration of American Democracy. He is a sitting U.S. senator, and he wrote a book about how companies and industries together hire lobbyists to convince Congress, pay them campaign donations and convince them to pass the legislation that they want. Read that book. Get that book. Capture: The Corporate Infiltration of American Democracy, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Okay, that is it for the news clips. And now it's time for everything else. Not COVID, not politics, yet still important and interesting. It's the news dump. And here's listener, subscriber, and musician Pete Coe with a new jingle. Get the week started.
Croaking frog jumping while you're swimming in the swamp. It's hiding in your swim trunks for today's news dump.
Oh dear, there's a frog in my swim trunks? I'm not sure if I'm disgusted or aroused. Taking me back to my childhood. Pete Coe, you've done it again. Let's start the news dump in North Carolina, Charlotte, to be specific, where the oldest living American died at age 116, surrounded by her loved ones at home, according to family members. Her name was Hester Ford, and she was 116 years old. Her great-granddaughter, Tanisha Patterson Poe, said, although we're saddened by it, we take great pride in the legacy that she does leave behind. She had 12 children. What? 48 grandchildren, 108 great-grandchildren, and approximately 120 great-great-grandchildren. Whoo-ee. Hester Ford is a legend. Now let's head to Texas, where two people apparently died after a Tesla, which was on its autopilot setting, had nobody in the driving seat, crashed into a tree and started a massive 4-hour fire that apparently took 32,000 gallons of water to extinguish. 2019 Tesla Model S slammed into a tree Saturday night. Like I said, nobody was driving, and the vehicle was moving at a high speed when it couldn't negotiate a cul-de-sac turn, apparently. Burst into flames with passengers still inside. But again, no one in the driver's seat. Very confusing. Terrible, terrible accident. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration now investigating 23 crashes involving Tesla cars believed to be on autopilot, according to the New York Times. I don't care. I still want one. Of course, over the weekend, Prince Philip was remembered for his unwavering loyalty at a very intimate funeral, presiding over the funeral Saturday. The Dean of Windsor praised the Duke of Edinburgh's kindness, humor, and humanity, as well as his unwavering loyalty to Queen Elizabeth and his service in the Royal Navy. Didn't he cheat on her a bit? Or is it just rumors that I saw on the Queen and Netflix? How dare I speak negatively of the prince? And maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, but because I was talking about climate, but the United States and China, the two world's biggest carbon polluters, agreed to cooperate to curb climate change with urgency just days before President Biden hosted this virtual summit I mentioned earlier, a summit of world leaders to discuss the issue. The agreement was reached by John Kerry, who made the Iran deal as well. I mean, that guy's a legend, like him or not. I do, actually. I like him a lot. There's qualities not to like, but John Kerry getting it done. Two countries are, quote, committed to cooperating with each other and with other countries to tackle the climate crisis, which must be addressed with the seriousness and urgency that it demands, said the statement issued Saturday evening. Big, big news. And I'm going to see about getting somebody on tomorrow's show to talk about this. Earlier, I mentioned some problems with the Tesla. Well, now there are also problems with the Peloton treadmill. There are issues with the regulator, whatever that is. But the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission says dozens of children have been injured by the Peloton treadmill. Safety regulators warned people with kids, the rich people who own and pets Saturday, to immediately stop using the Peloton treadmill after one child died and others were injured. Horrific situation. Apparently 39 incidents with a treadmill involving multiple or dozens of children, but did not specify how many. It's the majority of the incidents resulted in injuries. Wow, it's terrible. Don't get a Peloton treadmill, and if you already have one, return it or put a dog and small human fence around it like it's a pool. And tell your kids when they go off to college to not go to giant parties. I mean, not ones in houses. You hear about this every once in a while. A floor collapsed during a huge party near the University of Georgia over the weekend. At least 25 people were hurt when a floor collapsed at a 2-story house near the University of Georgia. Injuries range from cuts and scratches to a possible broken arm. Though, of course, investigators said the incident could have been much worse. Police estimated there were 500 people at the party when the first floor of the home collapsed into a crawl space, apparently. Yeah, that's too many people in a house. And that's also your news dub for Monday, the 19th of April. And now it's time for my first and only guest of today's show. Last week, I was watching PBS's Frontline. They had this new documentary called American Insurrection, and I was absolutely enamored by it. The reporting was excellent. They used hard data to follow all kinds of different connections with all of these different American terrorists. And this investigation took place over the last 3 years. Frontline collaborated with ProPublica to investigate the rise of extremism in America in the aftermath of January 6th assault on the U.S. Capitol. Frontline, ProPublica, and Berkeley Journalism's investigative reporting program team, which looked really impressive. They teamed up to examine how far-right extremist groups have evolved in the wake of the deadly 2017 Charlottesville rally and the threat they pose today. Joining me is correspondent for this documentary, longtime, very successful, award-winning journalist A.C. Thompson. He's a senior reporter at ProPublica. He's a correspondent for Frontline, and his work helped lead to the exoneration of 2 innocent San Francisco men sentenced to life in prison, prosecution of 7 New Orleans police officers, and a congressional investigation of the U.S. Border Patrol. His life was actually fictionalized in the HBO show Treme. Is that how you pronounce it? I never watched that show, but now I want to because this guy was really cool. I love talking to him. I look forward to talking to him again. He's on Twitter at AC Investigates. Here's my first conversation with A.C. Thompson. All right, so there he is, A.C. Thompson. I'm really psyched to see your face virtually after watching this documentary. I just want to say, everybody has to see it. Great work by a lot of people, and I'm really psyched to talk to you. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So how long have you been working on kind of this issue, whether it be with Frontline or ProPublica or anybody, kind of the extremist, right-wing, anti-government movement? How long have you been looking at it yourself?
I'm ancient. So the first time I did stories on this was back in the 1990s about what was then the resurgent neo-Nazi movement in Europe. And so I was reporting from Europe about the rise of the new Nazis across Germany. I then reported on hate crimes and a million other stories. But 2015, 2016, I really came back to this issue in a major way and have been tracking these groups since then.
I feel like I've been talking on the radio certainly since I started in media during the McCain-Obama campaign, and I was always sensitive. And in the Oklahoma City bombing, I paid a lot of attention to that. I was in New York on 9/11, so I was always curious about this. But my point I'm trying to make is this movement has been huge for a really long time, and we haven't really paid attention to it. Media, government, maybe even you could talk about academia, because we think so much about the foreign terrorist threat and resource that. So I feel like this movement has been going on and just has not gotten the attention it deserves. So I'm asking you for your opinion in terms of the way it's been looked at by reporters, much less government officials. How would you describe that?
Yeah, I would think of it in sort of two parallel movements, right? So you have the open white supremacist movement, and then you have this sort of militia anti-government movement that sits alongside it and sometimes overlaps with it. And actually, if you come into the current era, I would add a third sort of category, which would be the sort of MAGA extremists, the street fighters, the Proud Boys, these type of outfits. But with the first two, which are sort of what we've had variations of going back decades, you're absolutely right. After 9/11, there was a massive shift away from looking at those groups in the federal government. And there was a wholesale shift in towards looking at what's perceived to be foreign terrorism. And so that would be cases that in the FBI case system would be 265 cases are the kind of international terrorism cases. The 266 cases, the code for domestic terrorism, those really kind of got moved to the back burner.
Never heard it put that way. Wow. That's, yeah. A lot of reasons we can talk about why that is, but I want to stick to, kind of what you've been covering, what you covered in this special, which is so fascinating. The only good thing about talking about the documentary versus watching it is that we can get to some more nuance, but you do a really good job in the hour and a half here providing a lot of that nuance, because we want to talk in media or at our dinner tables about who are the Boogaloo Boys or who is Antifa, and we want to say, well, they're racist, they're sexist, or whoever we're talking about. The truth is, as you document really well, and as you can explain to me now, there are so many different gradations, and to minimize them is to really do an injustice to certainly fighting them, much less getting to know who they are and what they want. There's really, it's tough to categorize a lot of these different groups, from the 3%ers to the Boogaloo Boys to the Proud Boys, whoever we're talking about. You really can't, can you? Other than they're all men, mostly. Right.
There's a fairly broad ideological spectrum there, and it's easy to flatten them all into being the same thing. They're all white supremacists, they're all anti-government extremists, but it's more complicated than that. And I think it's useful to understand how these groups see themselves, and then also understand the image that they put out. So one thing that was really interesting with the militia scene, and the militia movement shows up in Charlottesville. Those guys are there. They're generally not white supremacists, but they feel enough affinity for the very far right and the white supremacist movement that they felt compelled to go there to defend the freedom of speech of those guys.
Let's try this one out. If someone wanted to apply, if they were an application process to we're talking about 3%ers.
Yeah, there is one. There is an application process.
Okay, well then is the question, where are you on race or something? If the person says, well, I'm a white supremacist, doesn't the 3%er guy go, listen, that's not our top issue, but you can join it? Like how does it looked at? You're not disincluded, eliminated if you are a white supremacist, the way that you would think that would be a litmus test for any organization.
Having looked at their application questionnaires, they want to weed out the Klan dudes. They want to weed out the skinheads. Yes, they do. And the kind of stuff that you'll see for them, for the militias, for the 3%ers specifically, is you'll see people, they'll ask you, how do you feel about racism, or how do you feel about this? And people will typically say Black Lives Matter is a racist organization, the Klan is a racist organization, Antifa is a racist organization, and I'm not a racist. That's what you'll typically, that kind of mentality.
Why isn't a question, there should be a question like, here's a picture of Martin Luther King. How does it make you feel?
Yeah, I don't know how that would go down.
Wow, I want to see that application. Do you have that?
I have it somewhere on my computer, actually.
I mean, I'll post it in the show notes or something later. You don't need to do it now, but I'd be really interested to see that. Anyway, go in terms of back to the question about how there's so much conflation of ideology amongst these groups that they're hard to categorize.
Yeah, you get, if we could see it we could see the spectrum going something like this. On one side of the spectrum, you have the full-on neo-Nazis. Then you have the white nationalists who don't call themselves neo-Nazis. Then you have outfits like the Proud Boys that you're always going to see as sort of white supremacy adjacent, but are not totally exclusionary. They allow members of color.
But they hate women.
They hate women, and they'll say, our slogan is the West is the best. We're into Western chauvinism. And a lot of the people in that group are former white supremacists, or they leave the group and they join more radical white supremacist organizations. Come on over. You have the anti-Muslim groups. You have the militia groups. And then you get all the way out and you have the Boogaloo Boys, who are sort of new iteration of the militia movement, who are basically extreme libertarians. They're into all kinds of esoteric and arcane libertarian theory, like agorism, minarchism, mutualism, all this stuff like that.
Wow, I've got a lot to learn. I don't know what mutualism is or any of those things, I don't think.
Yes.
Maybe I should join. This sounds kind of interesting. Is it something about farming? I'm all about my garden. I got that in common with a lot of these preppers.
I'll tell you, that's the thing with the Boogaloo Boys, like I say, who sort of they follow on the heels of the earlier militia movements. They'll tell you, I'm all about liberty. I'm all about freedom. I'm all about the Constitution. But then the only thing you really hear from them about is guns. I'm very, very concerned about gun rights. You don't hear about schools. You don't hear about regulatory overreach. You don't hear about Austrian economics. You just hear about guns.
One question that you're not probably qualified to answer yourself, but maybe you interviewed someone on this. I always get this sense, and I have talked to some experts about it that say there's some truth to it. But because I like gardening, I established a Facebook group for people who like to garden, people all over the country, and we talk about gardening, and some people have become friends and stuff. The point is, you can find common interests now online and have company there and meet new friends and so on. I feel like it's always been the truth about a lot of these militia types, these organizations, these Proud Boys. A lot of it is about camaraderie and having friends and a place to go on the weekend, and certainly people who share similar ideology. And shooting guns is fucking awesome. I've shot guns a ton of times, and all of the outdoors things that they do around it. But so much of it seems to be just about having a group of friends that you like to hang out with, and sure, you have a similar mission. But how much of it do you think is that, especially dealing with men, having a group of friends? Sometimes it's harmless, it's gardening. Other times it's a militia, and that's dangerous.
Right. We are the bowling alone society, right? Absolutely. A lot of this is men in particular looking for collegiality, looking for friendship, looking for companionship. And a lot of times you're talking about people who are really alienated until they find that online niche, which then becomes a real world hangout. Another thing that sociologists see a lot with the people that get drawn to the more and more extreme groups is that having a history of real serious trauma is not unusual. That's quite common. So, and I've met a lot of these guys that, they had a family member murdered. They got arrested at a young age for something. They had some horrible trauma in their life. A lot of them veterans who saw horrible things in the wars,
Well, we can talk about that issue there because obviously that's always been this weird political correctness about looking at the veterans community. But it's also stupid because if you're trained to fight in wars, and you did fight in wars, and you know everything about weapons and bomb, like it's not, you should look at people who have that kind of training, not baking. But let me ask you just another kind of general question. One concern I have is you guys did great reporting here. You've been doing great reporting on these issues for a long time. ProPublica, there's these young journalists that you taught to, this team that has all these databases, and they're identifying people in Virginia at Charlottesville, and they're identifying people at the insurrection. And it gives me like a certain pause and concern because there's a lot of, and then there's even just anybody, me on Facebook going, I know that guy. And it makes me worry that we're spending, there's too much responsibility for journalists and not enough responsibility for the FBI and the government agencies, including local and state, that should be doing what you as journalists are doing by identifying people, making connections. This guy knows that guy. They met here. This guy was over here. Like, I'm almost concerned about how good your journalism is and how much you're connecting dots versus the government authorities that should be doing that, and maybe why that is. What do you think?
I've seen a big shift. So if you go back to 2017 in Charlottesville, I feel like the federal government was not prepared. They were not making these kind of connections. They were not really invested in making sure that people didn't drive their cars into big crowds of protesters and kill them. And that has changed, I would say. I would say the last several years, you've seen a dramatic ramp up in the aptitude of the FBI and other federal authorities and their ability to make these connections, to identify people from social media, to know who the players are. And I think that's part of what you see after January 6th is this massive sweep of people, all these arrests. That's a new era. But really, you go through 2020 and you look at 2020, the Bureau was wrapping people up, anti-government extremists that were plotting various nefarious things throughout the year, and were pretty dogged about it. So I think you've seen a big increase in their aptitude and appetite for this stuff.
How much have you seen leadership affect that? Whoever's leading DOJ or FBI in terms of the resources that get put into that, how much does leadership matter, or is it more consistent with the career people?
I think honestly, what part of what was happening is a thing that you've identified is that there had been this focus on so-called Islamic terrorism, on international terrorism, and there just wasn't a lot of people that were schooled in white domestic extremism, and the people that were experts in that had left the Bureau. They'd aged out.
But we both know that that's, like, you're more of a journalist, I'm more of like a fucking idiot. And so, like, we both know that that's bullshit because you just can look at the statistics from the FBI of hate crimes and white supremacy and the terrorism of domestic Timothy McVeigh types, Ruby Rich, like these guys has been exponential for years since 9/11, way more. So it's like, if I was in charge, I would always resource the threat that's far more pervasive. And more specifically, the NYPD Joint Terrorism Task Force rents an apartment across from the mosque in New Jersey to surveil the fact that there might be one guy who might maybe have these, instincts. And then they give him a bomb, and then he detonates a fake bomb and they arrest him. Meanwhile, these militias are saying, we're militias. We're going to do shit. And no one seems to be watching them, is the way I keep kind of framing that. And I'd love to be wrong about it, AC.
No, I think that's what was going on for a long time. I think, like I said, I think it's improved a lot. And I think, honestly, that change has been driven at the agent level, at the field office level, and not at the top. And I think it's probably changing now at the top. You see that with the military, with Secretary Austin at the DOD being very aggressive about cracking down on extremism. But for the last couple of years, I think the aggressiveness was being driven by career law enforcement.
So I just want to now just get into this special and ask you to talk to me about a few of the people that you interviewed. First of all, you interviewed everybody. You interviewed leaders of the movement, people in jail. You interviewed victims' families. And that must have been really hard, specifically Heather Heyer's mom. You sat down with her. Susan Bro is her name. And she was the young woman who got mowed down, along with others, but she was killed. And I think we forget about that. A lot of people got injured that day in Charlottesville. And so I want to kind of start by just asking you, I mean, we've been talking for 15 minutes start, but about Charlottesville and where your reporting picked up there when you went there.
Yeah, myself and my colleagues, we felt like we needed to be in Charlottesville because what we were seeing was this vast increase in white supremacist tropes and content circulating around social media, and this whole new explosion of new white supremacist groups, many of whom were closely Trump aligned. And it was like the 80s, 90s all over again. Like, here's like a whole new generation of people spouting the stuff that you heard from the Aryan Nations and the Klan and Tim McVeigh 20, 30 years ago. So we went there. We knew that was going to be a big thing. We saw online in their chats, in their websites and web forums that people were talking about bringing guns. People were talking about bringing bats. People were talking about a lot of stuff that indicated there would be significant chance for violence. And that's exactly what happened that day. To this day, I don't think that the failures of law enforcement have been fully examined. And I think a huge amount of the blame for what happened lays with law enforcement.
I wonder about that a lot, especially even on January 6th with no conspiracies or anything, but just the posture, the culture of law enforcement, just not being as concerned about this threat versus that threat. Probably most accurately depicted during the Black Lives Matter protest in Lafayette Park, when these people peacefully protesting were tear gassed and shot with rubber bullets. And then January 6th, we saw a different reaction in terms of a new reporting saying, well, they were told to stand down many times when they asked for backup and asked for these resources. And we saw that would happen. I wonder how much it is the culture and posture within law enforcement itself and how that changes.
Yeah, I think it's
especially local law enforcement. Like, some of these guys are just AC. Some of these guys are good old boys.
Well, can I tell you the thing that we saw is reporting in the last year in the fall on the big pro-Trump rallies in D.C. is we saw really remarkable, very sophisticated policing from the Metropolitan Police Department.
That's a different agency, isn't it?
Yeah, and then
in terms of the culture, in terms of there's a lot of, I don't know. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, exactly. And so, that's a department that is dealing with protests all the time, that had a really bad reputation for a long time. But we were impressed at their level of professionalism. When you get over to the Capitol Police side, it's an entirely different story. Obviously, it's
the MPD is the DC police force, and then you're talking about the other agency is the Capitol Police, which is just different. How?
So they're basically the security guards for the Capitol building and the House and Senate office buildings. And while you see sophistication and professionalism from the Metropolitan Police, the local cops, when you get to the Capitol Police, it's like complete breakdown, complete failure.
Yeah, but I'm talking about, and I have known nothing about the Charlottesville PD, much less what their name is, or I'm talking about Mississippi. I'm talking about Foghorn Leghorn, who's running well, listen, this kid just had a bad day. Like, I'm talking about those guys. Like, they're not looking for these threats, and when they find them, they buy them Burger King sometimes.
Yeah. There's a lot of that out there, and there's a lot of in some cases, some members of these law enforcement agencies are also members of Three Percenters, the Oath Keepers, of the Proud Boys. And honestly, part of what you've seen in recent months is you have a police accountability movement that many police feel threatened by. And then you have right-wing movements that say, hey, we're on your side. And so it's not hard to understand how there might be sympathies there.
But let's be clear, you have an amazing, probably the most provocative, scary guy that you profile in this special is Steve Carrillo, who killed cops. And so let's be clear, there is a thread, and there are certainly groups that have that posture, and definitely individuals whose whole mission is to kill cops. And maybe you can explain kind of like, that's not an old idea. They are, I guess, the tip of the spear of government. They are government. So it is complicated and somewhat confusing, because they have been targets, and let's be clear, by almost entirely folks that are on the right. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, and that's a complicated thing that's hard to unwind. But basically, it goes something like this: the white supremacist movement and militia movements have historically been anti-government movements. They have been anti-state movements. They have wanted the basically overthrow the U.S. government in one form or another for decades. When Trump comes along, a lot of them say, oh, now we actually don't want the overthrow of the government. We like Trump. He's our dude. But we don't trust the FBI. We don't trust anyone else in government, but we're down for Trump. And as long as he's running the show, we're not going to advocate for overthrowing the government. That was how a lot of them felt. Once Trump's on his way out, they say, oh, now we're insurrectionists. Let's turn it over. However, one group, the Boogaloo Boys, throughout that whole time period, they say, no, we just want anarchy. We want to smash everything. And we don't care who's president. We're not down with Trump. We want to kill cops. We want to kill federal law enforcement agents in particular. And we want to hang the tyrants, AKA elected officials, and get the guillotine out. And that's been their trip all along.
Yeah, it's really confusing. My old friend Jimmy Dore, we don't talk anymore, but he's gone so far to the left, he's looped around to the right, interviewed a Boogaloo Boy, and they had common ground because that guy's not anti-gay, the Boogaloo Boy that he talked to. They had that common ground, AC. Is like, that's the thing. Like, so we go to these Boogaloo rallies, and there are trans members of the movement. There are people flying Black Lives Matter patches and signs. There are people who have patches on with martyrs. And one martyr is Vicky Weaver, who was the white separatist killed at Ruby Ridge. And another martyr would be Breonna Taylor or George Floyd. And you think, wow, it's exactly that phenomenon. But just to be clear, you earlier referred to them as insurrectionists, but I think that's because they refer to themselves, some of them that you interviewed, as insurrectionists, because there's been a lot of people on the mainstream right-wing media like your Hannity's, praise be the prophet, who say they're not insurrectionists. They don't, they or Tucker Carlson, but they, just to be clear, a lot of them do refer to themselves as what they are. I mean, textbook academic insurrectionists, right?
Yeah. And particularly the Boogaloo Boys, like that is their whole reason to exist, is for insurrection. But even with other groups, if you were following Parler in the days around the election and around January 6th, there was a clear pivot towards saying we are at war with the government.
How much of your time spent, we see you on camera a lot, but how much of your time is spent just researching all the connections of these people and the movement? Like, you must be so read into it.
I have a lot of smarter people I work with too. So
right. Yeah. But I've spent way too much. Yeah. I've spent absolutely way too much time in far right online rabbit holes. And like the weird social media space is the native habitat for these people in many regards. So it's the alternative platforms like Gab and MeWe and Parler and BitChute that people are circulating and proselytizing on, as well as the mainstream social media platforms until they get kicked off them. So like, that's how you understand these folks. Absolutely. One thing I thought was really interesting, I forget who you interviewed. I think it was Mike Dunn was his name, but one of these guys you said something about after Charlottesville, the movement became really distracted and fragmented, and there was a lot of infighting about tactics and stuff. And I think that we need to be careful by not making assumptions about where these movements are, because it changes so quickly in terms of leadership and goals and actual actions. But I thought that was interesting. What happened after Charlottesville? What did he tell you, which I forget which guy it was, about how as a reaction to that, and furthermore, you could probably argue as a reaction to January 6th, like a lot of guys went to jail. I think that matters.
Yeah. After Charlottesville, several different things happened. There were people who were part of the white supremacist movement who felt like, we can't be out in the open now, so we will go underground and commit acts of terrorism. And that's what happened. That was the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting at the Tree of Life. That was the synagogue shooting in San Diego. That was Christchurch. That was El Paso. There were other people who said, we need to rebrand. Like this brand, the white nationalist, white supremacist, neo-Nazi brand, clearly that's not a winning brand at this point. So you saw groups like Vanguard America, and it was a Vanguard America member who did the car terror attack that killed Heather Heyer in Charlottesville. They changed their name.
He's in jail for life.
He's in jail for life. They changed their name to Patriot Front after that. And they say, we're not going to use fascist imagery anymore. We're going to use the flag. We're going to use the eagle. We're going to use all this Americana. Another group called Identity Europa became the American identity movement and wrapped themselves in the flag. And then you had the Proud Boys who had been there and had always said, we're not white supremacists, but we're not really so down on that. And they said, look, we're just, good beer drinking American guys that love American culture. And so in some ways, they were perfectly positioned for that shift.
A part of American culture, I've always thought this about the Proud Boys, is they're that asshole that says to his buddy on a Friday night, let's fucking get in a fight tonight. Like, they like to fight. They actually love fighting in the streets. It's fun for them.
Seriously. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. You also took a good look at Michigan, and that was a really interesting segment in this special. You talked to the Attorney General there, who I think is fantastic, Dana Nessel. Is that her name, Dana? Right. But what about like that kind of Midwest movement, militia movement that's always been around, and what are the overlaps there with those Michigan? I think that does not get nearly enough attention, in my opinion. What happened in Michigan? They tried to kidnap and murder the governor, and it's because the President of the United States screamed for them to basically do it. Liberate Michigan, he said over and over. What did you learn during your time in reporting in Michigan after what happened there?
I'll tell you an interesting thing that jumped out at me that's not in the film is that a lot of the people involved in that plot had very, very tenuous financial situations. And at least two of them had massive tax liens levied against them and were in jeopardy of losing their homes or their property. And I'm telling you that because a lot of these guys that we meet in these scenes are basically on the verge of being dispossessed. They're Rust Belt guys who feel like they have been completely left behind in a corporate globalist economy, that corporate globalization has failed them and that nobody is listening to them. And I think there's often this deep economic worry and this antagonism towards the state because, hey, the kidnapping plotter that I interviewed, he has a $36,000 lien from the state government on his property for not paying taxes. And they say, the government is not only failing me, it's coming after me for everything. And then they turn towards, they come up with plans to kidnap and kill a governor. The alleged kidnapping plotter that I interviewed, Barry Croft, is just fascinating.
Yeah. That dude, you called him in jail?
He
reached out to you, right? Against his lawyer's better judgment. As soon as he said that, or as soon as you said that, it's like his lawyer told him, or he said, my lawyer told me not to call. I was like, oh, this is going to be good. Go ahead, AC. I hope you're recording.
It's so interesting. Like before he got wrapped up, he was on podcasts talking about executing public officials and executing government leaders. And, his notion was we need a people's tribunal to decide if these folks are violating the Constitution. If we decide they're traitorous, we need to kill them all. And that was this was circulating through Blog Talk Radio and YouTube videos and podcasts at that time. And that's the kind of stuff he was talking about. He dialed it down some during our interview, but his absolute belief is that our government today is completely illegitimate. It went off the rails 150 years ago. We're not following the Constitution the way we should be. I am a constitutional scholar, and if people don't follow the Constitution the way I think they should, we're going to go kill them.
It always like a couple times it pissed me off, and it does all the time when people talk. But we follow the Constitution, and I wanted you to yell at the guy that was saying it, like, which version? Like, it's fine, but everybody has their own interpretation. It doesn't mean we need to take up fucking arms just because we disagree with this interpretation of that. Reasonable people can disagree, but they don't obviously think that way. Also, did you mention this? Croft said that the reason why he had permission from God did you just mention that to me? Because you said it in the doc. Yeah, I thought that was really important. That's where, for me, that's a litmus test. God told him to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer?
Yeah, he, according to the Bureau, he told his colleagues that he had special dispensation from God to go out and kill people. Yes. And
did you bring that up to him?
Say what?
Did you bring that up to him when you talked to him?
I'm not sure I did. I definitely did ask him about executing government officials.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I asked him about God, but he made it a point to tell me repeatedly, I'm a Christian. I'm just going to put it out there. And he was very enamored with his faith, for sure.
How much does religion come up?
A lot.
Always
And
Christian.
Yeah, I would say that's the thing that probably people have messaged me and they said, you didn't talk about the religious component of all this. And I think that's a fair criticism. I think in retrospect, that's something we probably should have touched on more, is the sort of often millenarian, apocalyptic approach to Christianity that is propelling a lot of these people.
What about January 6th? What was your reporting prior to the rally, up to the rally, and then on the day?
So,
and were you surprised, knowing what you knew, following what you followed, the rabbit holes that you lived in? I don't know how you got out of them. Probably some days must be tough. But you couldn't have been surprised by January 6th. I mean, they were advertising what they were going to do in many, many places. So, yeah.
No. It had been like, we got through the election and I was talking to a friend, a smart person, a journalist, and he said, it's so good, like we're through the election and there was no violence. And I said, no, that's actually not what happened. Right. Actually, what happened was there were a huge number of violent incidents throughout the year, many of them connected to the election. In Olympia, Washington, people shot each other in front of the state capitol 2 weeks in a row at protests. There were a lot of significant incidents of violence leading up to the election. Every time I went to D.C., people were getting at these rallies, people were getting stabbed and seriously beaten, And I said, we have had a vote. The election's been called, but don't think that this is over, because it's not. And even to this day, I would say that the peril of a mass casualty terrorist event has not passed. There are tens of millions of people who have been radicalized by constant lies fed to them by a demagogic president who said, oh, this is all a mass travesty. This is a massive fraud. I'm actually your president. Your country has been stolen from you. What do you expect people who believe that to do? I mean, frankly, the fairly sound and sensible thing to do, if you believe your country has been stolen, that it has been hijacked, then to act in a violent and awful way.
Don't blame. I've been saying that myself. I've been using the example of on the night when the Republican electors in Michigan were considering throwing out the votes of like all of the black people from Detroit to throw Michigan to Trump. I remember feeling, I'm like, well, that would be it for me. I'd be in the streets for sure if they throw out a whole bunch of votes. So I absolutely think and believe the same thing. If you believed what Donald Trump was saying, I can understand. I think this is when I learned the difference recently between sympathy and empathy. I have sympathy for their belief. And so it makes sense. So it happens. And where are you on that day? Because it looked like you had special permission to go into the Capitol the day after.
So on the day of on January 6th, our colleague Ford Fisher, who's one of the producers on our film, was there shooting. And he was like, you guys should be here. I told you should be here. You're idiots. And he was right. And then the next day, we were at the Capitol interviewing the various different congressmen and Congress members. Only one of the interviews with Rep. Andre Carson shows up in the film, but we interviewed a bunch of people from both main political parties. And honestly, it was a little bit shocking to me how lax security in the building was, in the congressional offices, even at that date,
That's crazy. It's great. And I wonder, I'd love to see those interviews, because that's kind of this post event on, but you almost don't know, like we still don't, I feel like we haven't been able to kind of comprehend the consequences of what occurred that day and what it means. We're still trying to figure that out, and certainly still trying to figure out who was there. How do you think the investigation has gone? You make a really interesting point about how long it took authorities to identify people in Charlottesville versus how quickly they were doing it on January 6th. I wonder what changed.
Yeah, a counterterror expert messaged me after January 6th, and he basically said, once Congress gets targeted, things happen really fast, don't they? People are very concerned about this suddenly. And that was sort of his somewhat cynical, but probably accurate takeaway.
Great point. Yeah. That's true often of politicians. And once it happens to them, then they understand it. Well, listen, man, I'll let you go. I could keep asking you about this, but congratulations, frankly, on your whole career. I've been reading up on you, and obviously won a lot of rewards that you deserve, and you're doing great work. This is the most important issue in the country, I think, for a lot of different reasons, and you guys covered it great. You and your colleagues over there introduced me to a whole bunch of new reporters and sources, and I'm psyched to be a fan of your work and a Frontline and everything that you're doing. I look forward to talking to you again, AC. Thank you so much.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on, Pete. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, AC Thompson at AC Investigates on Twitter. That was hopefully as interesting to you as it was to me, but you got to watch it. I should have probably included some of the clips, but I don't have enough time. Ran out of time. Some of the clips from the show. He talks to so many of these extremists, along with all kinds of experts and journalists. Great work. Really cool guy. Psyched to make contact with him and kick off the week with a brand new guest. I do try to get new guests as well as some of our favorite regulars every week, so that it's not a complete booking nightmare. Booking the show is tough, but I enjoy it. I like the idea of thinking about who I should have on. I always love to hear from you and your suggestions, who you like, who you don't. standupwithpete@gmail.com is my email. Email me there for anything and everything. Sign up for a paid subscription to the podcast, and everything Stand Up will be yours. Join our community. Hope to see you Thursdays at 8 at our virtual hangout. Who should we have at the hangout? We should have a guest this week. All right, I'm done talking. I'm going to put this baby to bed and post it up on the internet so that I'll upload it, you download it, and get back to me. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. I love you. Goodbye. Take it away, John Carroll.
When you're tired of begging, saying pretty please, that's the time you gotta finally get up off of your knees. When you can't see the forest for the burning trees, you got to stand up. Hey, you've been sitting so long, you got the creaky knees, you got to stand up. Stand up. I think you're driving wheels with leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up, stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up, stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up, stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak March up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside. And listen well and it'll tell you not to run